I am delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, Dale Jarvis. One of the leading public sector folklorists in Canada, Jarvis is the Intangible Cultural Heritage Development Officer at the Heritage Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador. In his work for the Foundation, Jarvis is responsible for implementing the province's Intangible Cultural Heritage Strategy and developing community-based projects, which include outreach initiatives, oral history research projects, and a wide range of cultural programs that include a series of major folklife festivals in the province. I'm sure that every person in this room has benefited from the events he has coordinated and the research he has directed, including festivals featuring Newfoundland mumming and Christmas traditions, the province's agricultural history, and the culture of Russian immigrants on the island. He's held a number of positions in the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, including serving as a member of its Sectoral Commission for Culture, Communication, and Information, and overseeing the successful application for the Heritage Foundation of Newfoundland to be listed as a UNESCO-accredited NGO with observer status. His work has received wide recognition from bodies that include the City of St. John's, Memorial University, and the Helen Creighton Foundation. His writings have appeared in a variety of folklore journals, including Volkskunde and Material Culture Review. He's given keynote lectures at the Nova Scotia Heritage Conference and Heritage Saskatchewan Forum, as well as invited presentations at conferences organized by the Canadian Commission for UNESCO and the Vietnamese Ministry of Culture, Sport, and Tourism. His work has made an invaluable contribution to the culture of the province and the nation. The title of his talk this evening is Safeguarding Living Heritage in Newfoundland and Labrador. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dale Gilbert Jarvis.
Thank you so much. That sounds really impressive. So, we're talking about safeguarding living heritage in Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm going to be talking about the work that we do with intangible cultural heritage in the province. We're going to go on a journey. I may veer off towards the horizon at some point, but we'll try to sail you back home by the end of this talk today. But we'll start with a story. And not in my time, and not in your time, but in a time when pigs ran around with forks already stuck in their arses asking who wants a slice of ham. There was a woman who had 3 sons. Now, the first son wasn't very good. His name was Tom. The second one wasn't much better. His name was Bill. And the third son, well, that was the good son. And his name, of course, was Jack. They had no punt, no boat in which to go fishing. And so the eldest brother said he'd go up in the woods and cut down some timber so they could build a punt. Asked his mother to help. She baked him up some molasses buns, sent him off with her blessing. Off he went. He walked until he came to a spot in the woods where there was a stream that ran down along the rocks. And he sat on the rock and he took out his lunch, and who should come out of the woods but a wee little man, only about that big, came over and sat down on the rocks and asked Tom in a nice way if Tom would share some of his lunch. Go on, he said. There's hardly enough here for me as it is. You'll have to find your own. Very well, said the little man, and so you shall have your reward. And he disappeared back into the woods. When he was done, Tom got up, picked up his axe, went over, took the axe, gave a great swing, hit a tree, and the tree shattered into 1,000 pieces as if it was made out of glass. Tried another tree. It was the same thing. Every tree in the forest he tried, it was as if everything had been turned to glass. Put the axe on his shoulder, walked home. But that little man, talking about how that little man had put a spell on him. Next day, Bill decided he'd try his luck. Same thing. Mother gave him some molasses buns. Up he went into the woods, sat down on the rock, was just about to eat when who should come out but the little man. Came and sat down beside Bill, asked Bill if Bill would share his lunch. And Bill said, no. He said, I know what you did to my brother. You'll get nothing from me. Very well, said the little man, and so you shall have your reward. And he disappeared into the woods. Bill finished his lunch, picked up his axe, went over to a beautiful tree, took the axe, gave a great swing, and when the axe hit that tree, it rang in his hands, and sparks went flying as if it was made out of iron. And every tree he tried, it was the same thing. Put the axe on his shoulder, went home muttering about how that little man had put a spell on him. Well, the next day, Jack decided he would try his luck. Went to his mother and said, Mother, bake me up some molasses buns. I'm going up in the country to cut down some wood. And his mother said, Jack Yashy Cat, the back of the stove is the best place for the likes of ye. You'll get no molasses buns from me. Now, Mother, he said, I knows me rights. You made molasses buns for my 2 brothers, and so you have to make something for me. And she gave him an old, dried-up crust of bread and put her boot in his arse and pushed him out the door. And off he went. And he walked, and he walked, and he walked. Walked till he came to that same spot, sat down on the rocks, took out that dry crust of bread, and who should come out but that strange little man, asked him if he would share his lunch. And Jack, being the good son, took the bread, broke it in half, gave half to the little man, had half for himself. And when they were done, the man said, "What are you doing way up here in the woods?" And Jack said, "Well, I've come to cut down some wood so I can build a punt so me and my brothers can go fishing." And the little man said, "Why don't you try that tree right there?" Jack picked up the axe, went over, hit the tree with the axe, and the tree broke down into a pile of cut lumber lying right there in the middle of the forest. "That's a fine piece of work," said Jack. "You're not done yet," said the little man. "Walk around that 3 times. And so that's what Jack did. And when he was done, there was a beautiful boat all planked out. Most beautiful boat he'd ever seen. "Well," he said, "that's a fine boat." "You're not done yet," said the little man. Reached into his pocket, took out a little burnt piece of stick, gave it to Jack, and said, "Now touch both sides of the boat with that." And Jack did that, and the boat was painted in 7 beautiful colors, all the colors of the rainbow. "Well," said Jack, "that's the finest piece of work yet." The man said, "That boat is yours, Jack." And Jack said, "Thank you. And I don't mean to seem ungrateful. I've always wanted to have such a beautiful boat, but what good is a boat to me way up here in the middle of the woods?" And the man said, "Well, that is no ordinary boat. That's the boat that sails without wind or water. And all you have to do is get into that boat and say, 'Boat, rise.' And the boat will rise up and take you wherever you want to go. When you get there, you say, 'Boat, pitch.' And the boat will pitch down nice as you please, just like a feather on water." "Very well," said Jack. And he got into that little boat and he cried out, "Boat, rise." And the boat rose up into the air and shot off into the horizon. And maybe for now, that's where we'll leave Jack, suspended halfway between heaven and earth. That is an old story. It's a Newfoundland story, and there are several versions of that, and several versions that were collected as part of the work done by folklorists throughout the past, over the past 40, 50 years, I guess now. This is Herbert Halpert, one of the founders of the folklore department. The story exists in a couple different versions, like I said, in Newfoundland. And it's not always a little man. Sometimes it's an old crone of a woman who helps Jack out along his way. And it's a story that has similar versions that are found in many parts of the world. There's a very well-known Russian folktale called The Fool of the World and the Flying Ship. It's almost a Baron Munchausen type story where Ivan, the hero of the story, goes along and collects a series of helpers who help him out in his journey. And this theme of flying magical things pops up in world folklore the world around, whether it's a flying boat or a magic carpet. One of my favorite versions of the flying boat ship is a Norwegian folktale in which Ashfart, the ash lad, the Norwegian Jack, goes off and has very, very similar adventures. It was a story that was collected in the 19th century by Norwegian folklorists, but it's a much, much older story than that. It's a story that goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that boat, that magical boat that can sail without wind and water, is found in the Norse epics. And it was a boat that belonged to the god Freyr. And it was not only possessed of the ability to sail without wind or water, but Freyr could fold it up like a piece of fabric and put it in his pocket when he was done. A most remarkable boat. And here we see the dwarves of Middle-earth who are here building. You can see that magical boat right down here at the bottom. And they're busily engaged at making a whole series of things that pop up in Norse mythology. You'll see that the dwarf in the center there is with his little hammer banging away at a much larger hammer there, the hammer of Thor, Mjolnir. And that character who is kind of looming over watching the dwarves work is, of course, the god of mischief himself, Loki, who was sent to collect all these things because he had cut off the hair of Sif, Thor's wife. And you can see that the magic boat is actually resting on this hair that the dwarves have made for Sif below. These things continue on. We have stories like this in other parts of North America. This is the famous Quebecois folktale, La Chasse-Galerie, a flying canoe, in which a series of events befall a group of woodsmen on a Christmas Eve. These are old stories, like I said, but they continue to have new life today. Those of you who are beer drinkers might know this particular beer, Maudite beer with the Chasse Galerie there. And those of you who are fans of Marvel Comics fame, anyone who has seen any of the Thor movies might recognize that magical flying boat, which pops up in pop culture today. And this is a pretty good example of our living heritage. It's an example of how things come from the past and continue on into the future in sometimes surprising ways, that our folklore and our mythology is a living, breathing thing. Now, if you invite a folklorist who is a storyteller to give you a talk, you might get a story. If you invite a storyteller who is also a folklorist to give you a talk, you might get a folklore lecture as well. So I'd like to introduce you to a very good friend of mine, Vladimir Propp here, Russian formalist who wrote the morphology of the folktale in the 1920s, translated in the 1950s. And kind of an important work in that it broke down folktales into component parts. And Propp argued that you could take any of the folktales that he had worked with in the Russian tradition and kind of break them down into 31 pieces that you could then kind of rearrange to form the basis of any folktale. And furthermore, he looked at all the characters that existed in folktales, and he said there were about 6 or 7 different archetypal figures that pop up time and time again, that all characters in folktales can kind of break down into some of these characters. And the character that I want to talk to you is the one from that story, that little man who lives in the woods, in that particular version of the story. Propp actually has 2 different types of characters that this character could be. The donor or the helper. And you all know these characters. These are the magical helpers that in folktales assist the hero in their quest, or the ones that give them an object of power. They're the ones that help them along the path. They help them find the way in the darkness and give them the tools they need in order to succeed with their quest. This is what Robertson Davies, the Canadian novelist, would have called the 5th business character. Davies was talking specifically about opera, but it's that character in the opera who is not a major character, but without whom none of the action really happens in the opera. He's the person that kind of gets things moving in this story. And we all know these characters from stories. These are the fairy godmothers, those magical creatures with their magical sticks that give our young heroes help and provide them information and move them along on the right path. And in many ways, I guess that is how I see my work as a public folklorist with the Living Heritage Program, the Intangible Cultural Heritage Program, is that if this was a folktale, if I was in that story, I think that the role that I try to fill in some ways is that role of the helper and the donor, recognizing that maybe I'm not central to the story, but we have a role to play in keeping those stories moving forward. So every Padawan needs their Jedi Master to get things kind of moving. So some of you will know this character here, Dr. Jerry Pocious, who was my thesis advisor when I was in the graduate studies program here. And in 2002, Jerry Pocious was one of the people who went off to Rio de Janeiro. There's a hard job for you to work on drafting what would become in 2003 the UNESCO Convention on the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. This is a UNESCO charter. Many of you are probably familiar with the probably better known World Heritage Sites Charter, of which we have several World Heritage Sites in Newfoundland. UNESCO accredited sites, the most recent being Mistaken Point, Gross Mourne, Lansa Meadows, and Red Bay in Labrador. Jerry came back, and the Canadian government in 2003 decided that it would not institute the charter. They would not ratify the convention. And for several years, we argued with our federal counterparts to try and get them to change their mind, to try and get Canada to ratify the convention and to do the work of safeguarding intangible cultural heritage. And when it became obvious that that really wasn't going to happen in Canada, that's a lecture of its own for another time, what we did in Newfoundland and what happened in Quebec was kind of a typical Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador way of doing things. We said, well, if the federal government isn't going to do it, we recognize that we have the ability to do some of this work on ourselves. So in 2006, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador came up with its Creative Newfoundland and Labrador, a blueprint for development and investment in culture. And this was the first time that a government policy document used that phrase, intangible cultural heritage. And it made recommendations, some of which involved setting up a formal organization that would look after the commemoration and safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage in Newfoundland and Labrador. There it is there, Strategic Direction 7, Safeguarding and Sustaining Our Living Heritage, Intangible Cultural Heritage. The same year, the Association of Heritage Industries and Memorial University, the Heritage Foundation, a number of organizations across the province held a large heritage conference here in St. John's on the theme of living heritage, on intangible cultural heritage. It brought together people from kind of a broad range of heritage institutions, academic institutions, not-for-profit, government, volunteer-driven organizations, organizations like the Wooden Boat Museum, craft practitioners, elders from our Indigenous communities. And we talked about this business about safeguarding intangible cultural heritage. And Anita Best was hired on to take that work and turn it into a strategy, to take the work that happened at the conference and develop some kind of working plan so that we could actually start to do some work to kind of move this thing forward. Anita was, I guess, our first kind of helper, donor person who kind of moved things along, that kind of gave us some of the tools to start doing some of this work. And we recognize that we have a complex living heritage in Newfoundland and Labrador. We have a complex history of both settler traditions and Indigenous traditions here in the province. And some of our traditions are new and some of them are quite old. Some of them are very healthy and some of them are very much at threat of being lost. Some of our traditions are very well known and very well protected and very well acted upon. Our folk music traditions in the province are fairly strong. We have a number of organizations that work to do the work of safeguarding our living traditions around music and performance. This is Kelly Russell, who was the first person listed as a tradition bearer under our new Provincial Historic Commemorations program. Drawing inspiration from other projects like the Living Treasures program in Japan, which recognize living bearers of tradition as being people of value in our communities. Kelly Russell was recognized as our first one in a series of people who have been recognized since then. A great musician and recitationist, Kelly kind of embodies that living heritage of music. Some of our traditions, though, are a little bit less well researched, a little less documented, a little less well known in some of our communities. This is a tradition that one of our colleagues, Dr. Philip Hiscock, has done a lot of work documenting, the Maybush tradition. And again, an old tradition of decorating bushes for the Marian month, for May month, decorating them with blue ribbons. This is a photo taken just north of St. John's a number of years ago. And a good example of an old tradition which has survived in kind of isolated communities in the province and which currently I would say is at some level of risk of disappearing. There aren't a lot of younger people who know about this tradition, certainly not a lot of practitioners left alive. And so we have this range of things that the Heritage Foundation, the organization that I work for, was kind of charged to deal with. We had that strategy, a government policy, and then someone needed to take that kind of intangible document and develop tangible programs and activities around it. So I had been working with the Heritage Foundation since 1996, and in 2008 my job shifted from being about built heritage to being specifically about intangible cultural heritage. And the Heritage Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador, with funding from the province of Newfoundland, was the first organization in Canada really to have a provincially funded folklorist position on staff, the first kind of provincial level folklorist for Canada. Quebec has a similar office, and more recently, the government of Saskatchewan is also now funding a position with Mun grad in that role as their Intangible Cultural Heritage Development Officer. The strategy, nicely for me, kind of has 4 goals. There are 4 broad things that I'm supposed to do to help enact the Provincial ICH strategy. And this is kind of how they break down. Documentation, celebration, transmission, and cultural industry. These are the 4 pillars, I guess, of the provincial strategy. And so we do work that addresses each one of these separately, and then ideally develop projects that build upon all 4 of them in single projects. But documentation is a huge part of what we do. We recognize that traditions sometimes are at risk, sometimes traditions are not well documented, and sometimes communities wish they had the tools to safeguard their own heritage, but they just don't have the training or expertise to do that. So I kind of work in this in 2 ways. Part of it is to develop projects that document specific things, and part of it is to develop programs that enable communities to do some of that work themselves. So we do all kinds of ethnographic documentation. This is a photo from very early in I had less gray hair. That was probably 2008. This is in Labrador, on the Straits of Labrador, teaching a workshop on documentation on the Labrador Straits. And that's Alice Moore, is a friend of mine there on the right, who is a rug hooker, and we're talking about that tradition of rug hooking for the Grenfell Mission on the coast. So a big part of what we do is about documenting and then inventorying that information, storing that information, and making it accessible. We have the benefit here in Newfoundland of an amazing partnership with Memorial University's library and the Digital Archives Initiative. So we have as a section on the Digital Archive the Intangible Cultural Heritage Inventory. That allows us to store massive amounts of information and to assist communities to make their collections digitally accessible. So we go out, we do a lot of collection work. We also do a lot of digitization work with communities, helping them get their materials online. And the breadth of material on here is quite remarkable. And the stuff that exists out in communities is amazing. We worked over the last couple of years on a project with the Grand Falls Windsor Historical Society, who had a large collection of reel-to-reel and cassette tapes that had been compiled by Hiram Silk, fabulous name, who was a broadcaster, a CBC broadcaster, who just passed away 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. And he had done work starting in the 50s, right up until the 1980s, going out into communities and collecting stories. He was a radio broadcaster. He had several different radio programs. And he miraculously kept all of his field recordings. And so we worked with them to digitize hundreds of recordings. I think something at the moment, there's something like 380 individual recordings of Hiram Silk. Some of those recordings that he was making in the 1950s and 60s were with people who were in their 80s and 90s, who were remembering Victorian-era Newfoundland. Quite an amazing, remarkable collection. And that's just one small example of the types of community collections that we help put online. So there is an archival documentary component of what we do. This is a project that Spencer might remember that many years ago. We went off to Old Perlican and we documented a bunch of dance tradition stuff out there. And all that material has been digitized and placed online through the work of MMaP and through the Heritage Foundation and the DAI. Sometimes we work thematically. We identify objects or themes that we feel deserve some recognition or which are identified by communities as having community value. And then we develop research projects around that. We did a project several years ago on agricultural traditions. We work with the Agricultural History Society to document root cellars in Newfoundland and Labrador. Collecting information about food preservation and the technology of building root cellars. It's interesting, as a folklorist going and talking to people about their root cellars. It would be like me coming to you today and asking you questions about your refrigerator. It's kind of a strange thing for people to think about. But of course, we're in an era now today where food security is becoming of increasingly greater importance. So some of these older technologies about food preservation have incredible value today. And so we did a big documentation, we did some cultural mapping projects around that, mapping out the locations of where these materials are. Crystal Bray, who's now a folklorist working with the Wooden Boat Museum, and Julie Pomeroy, who's now the heritage coordinator with the town of Portugal Cove St. Philip's, worked on this project with us. I think Crystal drew floor plans of about 300 root cellars, I think, which a lot of boxes on graph paper. We're interested in all kinds of tradition, rural traditions, but then also urban traditions, traditions which we do see changing and fading. We did a project a couple of years ago on what for us turned out to be a really fascinating look at mill culture in Newfoundland. We did a project around mill baskets. We had a number of towns in Newfoundland that were built up around the pulp and paper industry. They had large mills, largely with a male workforce. These men would go off to work. They would take their lunches in mill baskets. So this is an example of one of these mill baskets. And the mill baskets evolved over time, starting in the 1920s up until the 1980s. And we were able to kind of do a typology of mill baskets and track how those changes occurred over time. Many of those mills now have closed. The mills in Stephenville area, the mills in Grand Falls, Windsor have closed. And so these things now become objects of nostalgia. We did an event in Grand Falls, Windsor, where this mill basket came. We called it Tea and Baskets. And we provided the tea, people brought their baskets, and we did a documentation project and interviews, oral history interviews, and material culture documentation around these. This is a simple object, but it allows us to talk about labor history. It allows us to talk about kind of gendered roles within the community. It allows us to talk about the development of unions in the community. So a simple object is a way for us to kind of talk about some really deep themes in some of these communities. I'm also interested in vernacular architecture. That's what my background is in. So we're interested in kind of fading and transitioning forms of architecture. I have an interest in things that maybe are not as prevalent now as they once were. This is an example of a lich gate, of which now there are only 2 left in the province. A lich gate was a gate built at the entrance to a churchyard, largely in Newfoundland in the Anglican tradition, where during the funeral ritual, a coffin would stop for a moment and rest. There would be a small portion of the service that would happen within the lich gate. Lich comes from an Anglo-Saxon word meaning corpse, and then the body would then be carried into the churchyard and buried. This is in Bonavista. We have no idea who this lovely lady is. If anyone knows, let me know afterwards. We'd love to identify her. So we do documentation work on some of these vanishing buildings. This is another example. This photograph taken from the Mun Folklore and Language Archive. This is a hay barrack, a type of agricultural structure with a movable roof. It was a structure that originated in the Low Countries, spread to New York area, then kind of made its way up along the Atlantic coast, eventually made it to Newfoundland. On the east coast of Newfoundland, this is from Kilbride. There are examples out in the Codroy Valley as well on the west coast. The roof raises up and falls, and then hay is stacked underneath it. It's kind of an easy way to store hay without having to make a barn. And these were very, very common, even in the early 20th century. And then by about the 1980s, they had started to disappear. This photo is from the early 1960s, the last one in Kilbride. So for this project, this was a documentation project, kind of remembering and recording people's stories before they vanished completely, because this is a type of architecture we'll probably never see again in the province. As I said, part of our work is about training people to do work themselves. So we go out into communities and we help people develop the tools to do some of this work themselves, some of this documentation work. And where we can, we bring in people to assist us with this. This was taken a number of years ago. That's Andy Kolovos there in red from the Vermont Folklife Center, who came up and helped teach a bunch of workshops on digital recording techniques. So we go out into communities, we help them. This was with a group of graduate students in the folklore department. We do a lot of oral history work. We're doing a lot more of that this year than we have in the past, in part because that's where we've been able to get funding to do work. A big part of that work is, again, going out, running workshops across the province and teaching people how to do some of that work, teaching them our systems for metadata so that they can then funnel that research back into Memorial University's collections here and make it accessible back out to their own communities digitally. We do projects that kind of bridge tangible and intangible. This is a good example of that, a project that we did, again, Philip Hiscock and I got some funding a few years ago to do a project on the folklore of wells and springs. Wells and springs, wells were some of the oldest vernacular architecture we had in our communities, some of the first things that were built in communities, and some of the only things that still survive in communities. And there's an incredible body of knowledge, much like root cellars, that is of practical use today. A surprising number of our rural communities still rely upon wells for water. And there are very complex systems of knowledge around how we maintain water quality in our communities. These are practical lessons that still have value today. We do a lot of work with graveyards as well, graveyard documentation, the right and wrong way to do things with graveyard documentation. But documentation isn't enough. It's not enough to record things and put them in an archive, even if that archive is accessible, because we recognize that these are living traditions. We want to work to ensure that traditions continue. So part of that is elevating kind of the attention that is given to these things. One of the most common questions I get from community members when I go out and start asking questions is, why do you want to know about that old foolishness? Why does anyone care about this stuff? Quite often, there is a feeling in communities that the stuff that communities do isn't valued, that it isn't important, that people's personal knowledge isn't as important as the stuff what someone at the university might know. And so part of what we do is to kind of raise the discourse around cultural traditions. And festivals and events are a big part of that. I show this quote all the time. It's one of my favorite quotes from Dylan Ripley, the founder of the American Folklife Festival, talking about their museum collections at the Smithsonian. They had all these instruments and cases. And when they founded the American Folklife Festival, this was one of their thoughts, was they wanted to take the objects out of their cases and make them sing. So and again, that's kind of part of what my job is to make objects sing, to take things out of a museum or an academic context and then celebrate them back in the community. We do that through festivals. And probably our most successful and longest running one is the Mummers Festival, which is happening again this December. This was our very first year. So this was a project that was started by, again, through a partnership with Memorial University and the Heritage Foundation. We had hired on Ryan Davis, who is still the coordinator of the Mummers Festival so many years on. He was a graduate student in the Department of Folklore at that point. And Ryan and myself and Jerry Poshus, we started this festival in 2009. We had no idea how many people would come out, if people would like it, if it would continue more than a year. Our initial plan was to just have it be a kind of a one-off festival. And the moment we did it, people started to say, what's happening next year? So these are some of the images from that very first year of the Mummers Festival. It grew exponentially for the first few years. Every year it doubled in size until it eventually kind of plateaued off. We thought if we could get 30 mummers out to walk around downtown, we'd be happy. We got about 300 or 400 the first year, 600 the next year, 1,200 the year after that. We've kind of plateaued at about 2,000 people who show up for the parade every year. And the overwhelming feeling when it was happening was one of joy. And that's something that we don't often get to experience much in our daily lives, just this feeling of kind of community joy. It's a remarkable thing when that happens. This is a photo from the first Mummers Festival at the Rooms. And here we are on the cover of the Walrus. Our second festival that we organized was the Festival on Fire, reinvigorating bonfire night traditions. Again, this was a tradition that had kind of faded and had been outlawed, much like mummering had been outlawed for a period of time. Many communities like St. John's no longer do bonfires with its history of burning to the ground. That's not necessarily a bad thing in downtown St. John's. But we knew that this was a tradition that had started to fade in many communities. So in 2010, we decided we would try and reignite this tradition. And we thought if we could get 5 fires for November 5th, we would be happy. 5 large community fires in different parts of the province. We would be happy with that. That was our goal. And we started looking for community partners. And instead of 5 communities, we ended up with 44 communities who had major bonfires. If you're not a Newfoundlander, you might think I'm talking about little backyard bonfires. That's not exactly what we're talking about. These are large-scale bonfires. And much to our delight, we ran this program for 2 years, and it has continued. And communities which, even during the festival, didn't have community bonfires are now running community bonfires. It would actually be a really good project for us to go back now and track the impact of that project to see how many communities are continuing to do bonfire nights. This is one from central Newfoundland, which I love to show when we have our friends from the Wooden Boat Museum with us, because there it is right there. One tradition kind of butting up against another right there. And that's an image from Carboneer, the first year that we had the first year we had the Bonfire Festival. So we celebrate things. We encourage people to talk about things. We kind of draw attention to traditions. And we also recognize that traditions need to shift from one person to another, that knowledge needs to flow within the community, between communities, and across generations. And so a big part of the strategy, and one that I feel we need to do a lot more work on, is this kind of idea of teaching people how to do things. Dances need to be danced. Songs need to be sung. People need to be engaged in this work. They need to learn and carry it forward. One of the little traditions that I'm very interested in, and which is the focus of this year's Mummers Festival, is our hobbyhorse tradition in the province. This is Ron Delaney, grew up in Riverhead, Harbour Grace. Now, one of the town organizers was for the town of Bay Roberts, the economic development officer for the town of Bay Roberts with his hobby horse. This is an old tradition. We know that Sir Humphrey Gilbert, when he arrived in Newfoundland in the 1500s, had a hobby horse with him then. It's a tradition that, again, has kind of gone through periods of popularity and then has faded. It's a tradition that is very well documented in the Mun Folklore Language Archive. When we went looking for hobby horses in 2009, I think we found 5. There were 5 existing hobby horses that we could find in the province. Very, very few hobby horses left, even in kind of our institutional collections. Munfla had 1 or 2 that are now part of the collection of the rooms. There were a couple private collectors who had hobby horses, but not very many horses left at all. And so part of the Mummers Festival, in addition to kind of celebrating traditions, we started hobby horse making workshops. There's going to be hobby horse making workshops running for the next several weeks leading up to Christmas, where you can go and you can learn to make a hobby horse for yourself. And those workshops have been remarkably popular. And we've taught all kinds of people all across the province to make hobby horses and Christmas bulls. And so now, looking back, like over the past however many years of the festival, 8 or 9 years of the festival, when we started off, we could find 5 hobby horses in the province. And now we know that there are hundreds of hobby horses roaming the streets of Newfoundland. We do other types of hands-on workshops with the Mummers Festival, like ugly stick making. I love showing this picture when I give talks, because most people who run heritage workshops at museum don't randomly get groups of teenagers showing up to engage in heritage conservation. But that's what happens with the Mummers Festival. Young people are engaged, they come out of their own volition, and they learn traditions, and they carry them forward another generation. Here's a bunch of people. That's Wayne Cave there in the background, our master ugly stick maker from Trepassey, who comes up every year and teaches people how to make ugly sticks. We're interested in dance traditions. I think that this is actually a piece of work that needs a lot more research and study. I know there's one graduate student, at least here, doing Jane Dennison, who is doing work on dance traditions. So this is from that workshop that we had with MMaP many years ago in Old Perlican. Again, dances need to be danced. This is part of this idea of transmission, that we need to share these traditions in an engaged way, that people need to do things, they need to learn how to run the goat and thread the needle. I'm really interested in anything that involves food. So anytime we can build in a food component to workshops, we love to do that. This is Maria Lesiv, one of our folklore professors here at the university, teaching a pierogi making workshop as part of a festival, the Newfoundland Festival that we ran several years ago. Maria came and made pierogies for us, and I was there kind of as the instigator and questioner and asking her questions. And at one point I remember asking Maria, "Oh, Maria, tell us about where this recipe comes from." I was hoping for this great kind of folkloric story about her family and her grandmother, and she said, "Oh, Canadian living," she said, is where she got the recipe for making her pierogies, which I think was like perfect example of kind of folklore in action, right? And this is something that we will continue with, food workshops, hopefully moving forward in the new year. And hopefully as the St. John's Farmers Market kind of comes on stream and has more facilities for doing this type of work, hopefully this is something that we will continue to grow in the community. The last piece of this strategy is about cultural industry, because we recognize that we want people to live traditions, but they have to be able to live. They have to be able to make money. They have to be able to develop a market for their craft. We know that industry is a part of what we do. We want sustainable communities, or communities that are more sustainable. We want tradition to be a way that people can continue to do what they've always done. So one of the little projects we did a number of years ago was on community concerts. And this was something that came out of community consultations. When we asked people, what are you worried about losing in your community? Many people said, we used to do parish concerts, and we don't do it anymore. Parish concerts are a great example of intangible cultural heritage because it encompasses so many things. It's about a kind of a sense of community building, but it's also a way of maintaining other traditions around music and craft, and food traditions, dance traditions, song traditions, recitation, monologues. This is a tradition I knew nothing about before we started, the tradition of drills. There's a good ethnomusicology thesis topic right there. Drills are kind of these choreographed movements that, in this case, young girls would do, or they would kind of march around to music. Very, very popular in the kind of the early to mid 20th century. And so these are a group of young ladies from Portagrave. This is Mona Petton, former board member of the Heritage Foundation. I think this is her right here. All of those dresses are made out of paper. They only had to last one night. Talk about intangible cultural heritage right there. So this was something that the communities had identified as being important. So we worked to create a concert series with those communities. Heart's Content, Cupid's, and Bay Roberts, each of those organized community concerts showcasing local talent, local tradition, local music, local food. We agreed on a shared price. Our job as kind of the helper in this project, we did all the marketing for them. All the money that was raised went back into community-based heritage projects in the community. So the money was raised by heritage for heritage in the communities. So those are our 4 goals: documentation, celebration, transmission, and cultural industry. I want to go back to this fella when I started off with. I told you a story. I told you a story about a little man in the woods. And you believed me, I think. You all believed the story. And I told you another story about Vladimir Propp and donors and helpers and whatnot. The trouble with fairy tales is that fairy tales are true on many levels. And one thing I hate about storytelling is when someone tells me a story and then says the moral of the story is, as if stories only have one moral or one meaning. Stories are multi-layered. So we recognize that stories change. We recognize that scholarship changes over time. And while Vladimir Propp may have been kind of a good example of work that was being done in the 1920s, we recognize today that there are problems with some of his work and some of his conclusions. And some of his breakdown of characters don't really fit other things. His breakdown of character types don't really address all the characters that sometimes exist in traditional narratives. And so I talked about this character being kind of the donor and the helper character. And in a lot of those other versions of that story, in the Russian versions of the story, the Norwegian versions of that story, there is very clearly a character who is the helper and the donor. In other versions of the Newfoundland folktale, the helper and the donor is that old crone, that wise old woman kind of archetype. In this particular story, though, the helper is this character, the fairy character. And what that does, it changes the narrative a little bit. Because while on the surface, it seems like it's the same type of character, the act of taking one of those stories and turning it into a Newfoundland story, of taking a European story and adding a Newfoundland version to it, incorporating a fairy character, means that that character is no longer just a donor or a helper. And in some ways, he is kind of an unreliable character. He's the trickster character. And we listen to the story and we kind of put our kind of Judeo-Christian gloss on this story, and we think, the story is about, the good, helpful person gets rewarded and the evil person is not rewarded. And that is certainly one way to view that story. The fact that it is a fairy, though, in the story makes me kind of question what that story is really about. And is the fairy character actually acting in this kind of logical manner, or is it just kind of a whimsical thing that the fairy has done? Every story that I can tell you about a fairy action in Newfoundland traditional narrative, I can find you a story where the opposite is also true. So while there are stories about fairies who are helpful to the righteous, there are just as many stories about fairies who are completely unhelpful to the righteous. Fairies are a better example kind of that trickster character that operates with a logic that is slightly different from the other characters in the story. So that idea of the fairy in that character, the fairy character in that being the fifth business character, may or may not be true. Instead, it is this kind of trickster figure. This is a figure that pops up from time to time in literature. We talked about Loki earlier in that Norwegian story, the Norse story. And so then in my story, am I the donor, the helper, or am I something else as well? Am I also the trickster character? We talked about the mummer tradition and the hobbyhorse tradition. And in a way, it is about maintaining a tradition, reviving a tradition that has been in place for many years. This was the poster that was developed for 2011, the Mummers Festival, a photo from the 2010 festival. That's me right there. And those of you at the back might not be able to read this, but it's about terrifying and delighting children for over 400 years. So the idea that heritage is not always about delight. Sometimes it's about terror as well. And I am very pleased to be able to stand here today and tell you that when I went out as a hobby horse during that first Mummers Parade, I made 2 children cry. Keeping alive, I think, a very important and understated part of our Christmas traditions in North America. That was certainly a part of Christmas many years ago, a part which we don't celebrate that much anymore. So I like being the trickster. Sometimes I like playing with heritage. I like people thinking about heritage in different ways. When you send out a press release to CBC saying you're going to have tea with hookers, CBC calls you back. We had a project called the Grey Sock Project, knitting our heritage. And on one level, it was a transmission project. It was a project that honored the contribution of the Women's Patriotic Association during the First World War, knitting socks for soldiers. We ran all kinds of knitting workshops. We taught new knitters how to start knitting. We taught experienced knitters the skills around darning. And we knit a lot of socks. Because I am, in my heart, a little bit of that Loki character, we flipped the original narrative. And instead of those socks going to the war effort, we made those socks go to Syrian refugees. So we kind of turn some stories on their heads, and we do new things with old traditions. I love doing those kinds of things. I talked about our food workshops. This was another one where I like to kind of get people thinking in kind of critical ways about what is heritage and what isn't. We ran a food workshop, a 2-part food workshop called From Syria to St. John's, again working with Abir Zain, a local Syrian refugee who taught our baklava making workshop, and we partnered that with a workshop on traditional Newfoundland tea buns. So we taught traditional skills and very definitely taught untraditional skills as well. Even Abir herself talks about how she twists tradition. These have cream cheese filling, which is probably not traditionally Syrian, but which is really good. This was a project that we did just a couple weeks ago as part of our Adapting Heritage Conference. Again, I like playing with heritage, getting people to think critically about what is heritage and what isn't. We did a project on rug hooking. We do lots of work with rug hookers. We had Ruth Noseworthy Green, come and talk about the tradition of reuse and recycling. And then we had Trent Hardy come in, who is a mat maker there. You can buy his mats at various craft fairs and at the Rooms gift shop. And here he is weaving mats from old fishing twine, saving twine from landfills and turning it into a new type of project. There's another project I helped work on, which is coming very, very soon, I think opening on Friday down at Escape Quest. If you were at our Heritage Forum, you would have heard Kevin Noseworthy talking about the fairies. We did work with him talking about fairy traditions. He was inspired by the work of Barbara Rietti and her book, Strange Terrain, and they're developing an escape room based on Newfoundland fairy tradition. So it's kind of a new way of keeping some of those old stories moving forward. So where's Jack in all of this? Jack, in the boat that sails without wind or water. What happens to Jack? What happens to Jack at the end of the story? So maybe if my role is donor or helper, or maybe my role is a trickster, maybe it's not my job to tell you. Maybe my job isn't to always be the expert. Maybe my job is to, in the words of Freeman Tilden, the author of Principles of Interpretation, my role is to provocate, not to instruct. But maybe that is my role. Maybe my role is to make you want to go out and find out some things for yourselves. So, if you want to find out what happens to Jack, you can go to the Munfla archives and you can do some research for yourself. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. We have some time for question and answer here in the MMaP gallery, and from those watching the live stream, Dr. Megan Forsyth is MMaP's program coordinator, and she will be serving as social media host this evening. Recently, we've had a little bit of problem with latency and unreliability in the YouTube chat room, so if you're watching on the live stream, please send your email your questions to us at mmap@mun.ca. That's MMAP at mun.ca via email, and we'll be happy to include your questions in tonight's Q&A period. But let's start with a question from the gallery.
Yes.
About 25 years ago, there was a bonfire over near Bay Roberts. A crowd of teenagers down the beach on bonfire night.
Yep.
And I went down and asked them what they were celebrating. And not one of the teenagers knew what they were celebrating. They said, oh, it's the 4-H club. And that was fine. They were having a lovely time. And I noticed this year there was someone interviewed on CBC at a bonfire, and they were asked the same question, and they didn't know the answer. It doesn't matter.
Oh, there's a $1,000 question right there. I think tradition is always something that evolves and changes. And I think, you know, the work that I do with UNESCO and the work with the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention notes that living heritage is constantly in a state of evolution, influenced by its own history and its own geography and the things that are happening in the community. And one of the signs of strength of a tradition is its ability to change and morph into newer things. So ultimately, if it is a tradition within a community, and the community doesn't choose to maintain its historical knowledge, I don't think it matters. If it still has a vibrancy and a meaning for itself within the community, and we see that with the bonfire night tradition. You know, certainly we can study things historically, or we can study and look at how things kind of exist today. And I think bonfire traditions are a really good example of that. There are certainly communities that know some of that kind of British history, the plot to blow up the Parliament buildings. Some people know that history, and for them that is an important part of their narrative. Other communities don't know that, but the kind of community aspect, the youth aspect of it is still what matters to them. So I think the answer, maybe in a roundabout way, is that does it matter? It matters to the people it matters to. That's kind of a weaselly way to answer that question, I guess. But I think, you know, certainly that there are people within communities who maintain traditions in different ways. For me as an outsider coming into a community, I think my role is to kind of understand the context of that community and then to help communities celebrate the traditions that matter to them. So in some communities, for example, there is no guy that is placed on the top of a bonfire, which is a kind of an important part of some kind of more traditionally British aspects of bonfire night traditions. Some communities place something on the top of the bonfire, and if you ask them why, they wouldn't know. The Carboneer bonfire, for example, they had one of those giant spools, that you wind telephone wire on cable on. And they had very deliberately saved that to the end and put that on the top of the fire. So me, with my folklorist brain, I'm thinking, oh, that's obviously like a representation of the guy. And when I asked people why they did that, they just said, I don't know, it's what we've always done. We've always put something on the top of the bonfire. I was in another community and they had a chair. And so the wooden chair was what was placed on the top of the bonfire. I think there is probably an educational role that we can act out sometimes and let people know some of the history of what the tradition is. But again, at the end of the day, the community is the one who's going to decide what they carry forward. And my job is to kind of watch the world burn, I guess. I don't know. Does that answer that question?
We have a question from the internet. Megan Forsyth.
Hello. How can these strategies be implemented in areas where government support is unavailable, and what can folklorists and ethnomusicologists do to further the work of preservation on their own?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. The nice thing about the ICH strategy, I think, is that it is scalable. Like, we can do big projects like the Mummers Festival, but quite often some of the projects that we do are very, very small and very, very low budget. I think people can look at that strategy and think, okay, we want to document some things, we want to work on celebration, we want to transmit things, we want to help, support people who have traditional crafts in our community. Those aren't necessarily things that take a lot of money. I do think what sometimes communities need is assistance in doing that, in kind of thinking things through. One of the most common requests I get from communities is that people will phone me and say, we want to do something about heritage. We know we have heritage, whatever that means, and we don't know what to do about it. So the second part of that question is, what can ethnomusicologists and what can folklorists do? I think we can kind of have conversations with these communities and help them start to identify things that maybe they are concerned about. One thing that I do quite often with communities is we will do kind of a brainstorming session. UNESCO breaks ICH down into 5 categories of things, such as oral traditions or understanding about our place in the universe. There are 5 categories of ICH, traditional craft. I will go into a community and I'll say, here's what UNESCO says ICH is, and then we'll start to kind of pick out all the hundreds or thousands of things that they have in their community that are examples of intangible cultural heritage. And then we will go through a second process with the community where they start to identify which aspects are either most at risk or which they feel that they can make the greatest impact on in the community for the least amount of money. Which are kind of so we kind of have a 3-part triage system that we use. We look at stuff that is kind of important, we look at stuff that's at risk, and we look at projects that are feasible with the budget that they have. And then we develop tiny projects in communities that help them move forward. A good example of that is a project that we did in New Perlican very recently. We went into the community, we did a kind of a public planning session, we talked about ICH, we mapped out things in the communities, and one of the stories that kind of floated to the top was that, everyone used to have goats. And I said, that's kind of unusual. Like, not every community had a reliance on goats. They thought that that was something that every community had. And I said, nope, not every community had lots and lots of goats. So we actually did a little project with them where we talked about goats and talked about how people used goats, what they used goats for, how they went through the process of kind of animal husbandry. We did an oral history project in the community. We did a heritage book called The Goats of New Perlican. And the community then now has this booklet that they can sell in the community to raise money for other heritage projects. Tiny little project, didn't really cost a lot of money, but it took someone with some skills in community facilitation and asking questions and kind of being able to think outside the box, thinking outside of the community to kind of help them move forward. And I think that's the role, ultimately, of a public folklorist or a public ethnomusicologist, is to kind of get things happening and moving in communities.
I was just wondering, so I love the Mummers Festival, and I'm wondering about the impact of that, if we just think about mummering, the impact of that festival outside of St. John's, because it seems like it's become kind of an urban tradition now, as the Mummers Festival has become so popular in town. So I was wondering if you could talk about sort of the broader province and that tradition.
Yeah, the Mummers Festival is a PhD thesis waiting for someone to do work on, because it is in many ways a cultural revival, and we can have a long discussion about what that means and what that means in terms of the tradition. Like, how much do you change the tradition by kind of reinventing it? One of the reasons why we picked kind of mummering traditions was that, again, mummering is one of these traditions that kind of ebbs and flows. It's at times very popular, at times it's in decline, and it kind of reinvents itself. And when we look kind of broadly at the history of mummering, mummering was something that did happen in an urban context, these kind of promenading types of mummering that happened in urban centers, that after the ban in mummering in the 1860s kind of died out, and mummering became a very kind of specific thing, that kind of house visiting tradition, which is one type of mummering. When we started the festival, and other people had done mummering activities before, when we looked at the tradition, it was very easy for anyone to go into any craft shop anywhere in the province and buy a mummer. Like, you could buy it. It had been commercialized. You could buy a mummer on something. You could go to the heritage shop and you could buy something with a mummer on it. What you couldn't necessarily do in an urban context was go mummering. And so the idea was to kind of take this tradition and, again, flip it, play with it, and create an opportunity for an urban population to kind of experience it in a different way. The idea always was that it would inspire people then during the 12 days of Christmas. We deliberately did it out of the traditional mummering season. We could have a whole discussion of when that actually is. We had it before Christmas. The idea was that people would then kind of be inspired to go out during the 12 days of Christmas and mummer for themselves. And anecdotally, we found that that has happened. People have said, oh yeah, we went mummering the Mummers Festival, and then that encouraged us to then do that. The tradition continues to change. One of the really weird, interesting things is that after we did it in St. John's in 2009, and we weren't the only ones who were doing it, there was a mummers walk that was happening kind of simultaneously on the Northern Peninsula. Several communities across the province now have mummering parades that take place. Clarenville had one the year, I think, after we did the one in St. John's. Bonavista now has an annual mummers parade, which happens during the Church Street Festival in July and August, which is a very untraditional, traditional kind of mummering, right? So yeah, certainly there has been an impact and a change, and again, this goes back to kind of an earlier question. Like, does it matter? Does it matter that it shifts and change? I think it certainly creates more research projects for graduate students. And I think as well, though, it does indicate that there is certainly an interest out there. I think the Mummers Festival really tapped into a deep interest and a love of that tradition in the province, and has in many ways kind of rekindled it, and is now becoming its own tradition in its own right. And so there is now a generation of young urban St. John's kids who have grown up going to the Mummers Festival every year, that is something that is now part of their Christmas tradition. So yeah, traditions change all the time, and I kind of think that's a good thing. I think if you try and pickle a tradition, that changes it in a way as well. Yeah.
When I was growing up in St. John's, we on Halloween we called that mummering, and it was the Americans who talked about trick-or-treating.
Yeah.
And until the mid-50s, it was always mummering.
Yeah.
And you had to perform in order to get a treat, or, something. But it's certainly, that was our mummering tradition in St. John's when I was a small child.
Yeah.
At Christmas time, we went out on Boxing Day to exchange gifts. And there might be some singing or whatever, Christmas carols or what have you. But that was our visiting at Christmas, and our mummering was on All Saints' Day Eve, Halloween.
I think if you say to someone, do you know what a mummer is, or do you know what mummering is? Many Newfoundlanders will automatically say yes. And I think their assumption, their unspoken assumption, is that they think everyone else is thinking the same thing that they're thinking. And that is not true, that it is a tradition that has changed dramatically throughout the centuries, and it is a tradition that has very strong regional variations. People call it different things, and they enact it in very, very different ways. I think most people kind of think of the Seminai song and the Land and Sea episode as being kind of the canon of what mummering is. And that's just one type of mummering in one community in one decade. And quite often, I will hear, Newfoundlanders of a previous generation say things about like youngsters going out for Halloween. They will say, youngsters got mummered up for Halloween. Like that mummering, the act of mummering is a disguised tradition. And certainly when we look at those kind of disguising and visiting traditions, I said, we had the Mummers Festival outside of the traditional mummering season, which is kind of the 12 days of Christmas. But there were traditions up until recent years in places like Harbour, Maine, Conception Harbour, tradition of derbying, which would start in October, which was a kind of a blackened face tradition, going door to door. And there are accounts of mummering continuing well into February, that it was kind of a Lenten tradition, and certainly other parts of North America. The Mikarem tradition in Acadian communities is a Lent tradition. So yes, our understanding of traditions sometimes is not as deep as we think it is. Sometimes, and I think maybe that's part of my role as well, sometimes, is to kind of say to people, actually things are a lot more complicated than you think they are.
If there are no more questions, I'd like to thank Dale Jarvis for this wonderful talk this evening. I'd like to thank our social media host, Dr. Megan Forsyth, video director Spencer Crew, camera operators Ophelia Ravencroft and Jacob Danson Faraday, and all of you for coming out. If you missed any part of tonight's talk, you can watch it on our YouTube channel, where it will be posted in the next few weeks, and where you can find videos of other center events. Thank you, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much.